What's new? Meal patterns, sodium, and whole grains. Welcome! Today we will be covering the breakfast and lunch meal pattern for the school year 2014 and 15, sodium targets for breakfast and lunch, as well as the new whole grain rich requirements. So let's take a look at the breakfast meal pattern for the school year 2014-15. First, we will cover what has not changed. There are still 3 components at breakfast. The juice fruit veggie component, which was formerly known as the fruit component, as well as grains and milk. Please note that the meat alternate component is not required, but if it is served, it does count as a second grain or an extra. So meats are still grains. Things that have changed are the fruit juice veggie component, which has increased to offer 1 cup daily and 5 cups weekly for all grades. Please be reminded that grains daily and weekly minimums must be met. If you were to offer only the daily minimum of 1 ounce of grains, you would not meet the weekly minimum requirements of 7 ounces minimum for K through 5, 8 ounce minimum for 6 through 8, or 9 ounce minimum for 9 through 12. Let's take a closer look at the fruit juice veggie changes for breakfast. As we discussed in the previous slide, the fruit quantity will increase to 5 cups per week, with a minimum of 1 cup daily. With offer versus serve, all students must have a minimum of half a cup fruit juice veggie to have a reimbursable meal at breakfast. Remember that all forms of fruit count in this component. Juice must be 100% full strength and can meet up to half of the fruit offerings over the week. There is no maximum requirement for fruit. However, the calories and other nutrients must be met. The food buying guide should be used to credit all fruit. Vegetables may be offered in the place of fruit. However, if starchy vegetables are offered, you must offer 2 cups of non-starchy vegetables over the course of the week. So if you want to serve that hash brown, then you must offer 2 cups of another vegetable during that week. Now let's talk about the lunch meal pattern for school year 2014 and 15. There aren't any changes to the components for this year, and the weekly maximums have been permanently lifted for meats and grains. However, all minimum nutrients must be met throughout the week. Remember that the daily and weekly minimums must be met for all serving lines. Let's say you're at a high school that has a separate salad bar and a separate sandwich line. On your sandwich line, you offer 2 ounces of meats and grains per day. You will not have any trouble meeting the daily and weekly requirements on that line. You would also need to meet the daily and weekly requirements on the separate salad bar line, which may be more difficult to do. Vegetables at lunch. The daily requirements for vegetables varies by grade. For K through 5 and 6 through 8, it's 3/4 of a cup. For 9 through 12, it's 1 cup. You can offer as many vegetables as you would like as long as the nutrient requirements are met. Just like fruit, no more than 50% of the vegetable offerings can be from juice. We are still seeing issues with meeting all of the vegetable subgroups for multiple lines. So let's go back to that high school that has the separate salad bar and separate sandwich line. The weekly requirements for vegetable subgroups must be met for each line. So for your salad bar line, you must include all of the required subgroups, including those not typically seen on salad bars, such as beans and peas. Now let's talk about the new changes for the National School Lunch and School Breakfast Program for school year 14-15. The first sodium target became effective on July 1st, 2014. All grains offered must be whole grain rich. This leads us to the question, what is whole grain rich? Foods that qualify as whole grain rich must contain either 100% whole grain or a blend of at least 50% whole grain flour and enriched flour. This slide illustrates the first sodium target for school year 14-15 for breakfast meals. The new sodium targets for lunch are listed here. Please note that these changes became effective on July 1st, 2014. This next slide lists some of the techniques you may use to reduce sodium. This is certainly not anything close to an exhaustive list. So we encourage you to continue to think creatively about other sodium reduction strategies. Look at your menus and start with varying your seasoning choices. Preparing items in-house allows schools to start with relatively low sodium staple ingredients and control how much sodium is added during production. We also suggest using USDA foods, as many products are currently low sodium and many more are being modified to lower sodium levels even further. Careful menu planning is the key to reducing sodium. Schools can modify procurement specifications to request lower sodium products and begin reading nutrition labels on products to become familiar with which items are the greatest contributors of sodium to the meals. Schools should consider alternate seasonings choices such as lemon, vinegar, pepper, herbs, and spices in place of salt. Finally, schools should be aware of their condiment offerings, particularly since these are included in nutrient analysis and are often high in sodium. If a food item is a grain-based product, such as bread or cereal, it must contain at least 50% or more whole grains by weight, or have a whole grain listed as the first ingredient on the ingredient label. If the food item is a mixed dish product, such as a lasagna or a stir fry, a whole grain must be the primary grain ingredient by weight. The dietary guidelines now allow that if the first ingredient of a grain product is water, a whole grain may be listed as the second ingredient and still meet the whole grain rich criteria. In order to know if a product is a whole grain rich, you need to know what a whole grain is. Whole grains are cereal grains that contain the germ, endosperm, and bran, in contrast to refined grains which only retain the endosperm. This slide presents some examples of whole grains. However, it is not meant to be all-inclusive. These examples include instant oatmeal and brown rice. You also notice that popcorn is listed, but please note that popcorn is not creditable for lunch or breakfast, but does count as a whole grain for smart snacks or an a la carte purchase. USDA issued a memo in May of 2014 that provided flexibility for pasta products that are not whole grain rich. In short, for those school food authorities that previously removed popular pasta menu items that when produced with whole grain rich pasta did not hold well, or students no longer consumed or selected the popular item, and the school food authority has demonstrated hardship in obtaining acceptable whole grain rich pasta for that item. You may request a waiver from your school nutrition area consultant to continue to serve enriched pasta during the school year 2014-15 and school year 2015-16 if needed. Remember to include a justification for your request. For example, an approvable request may state that the use of the new whole grain rich pasta or the degradation of the new whole grain rich pasta during the typical holding time negatively impacted the taste and texture of the product, and that the school food authority received increased negative student or parent feedback as a result of this change. Once you're approved, you will receive an official letter from your area consultant that you should keep in a secure file for auditing purposes. Let's discuss extra enriched grains even further. Grains not meeting the whole grain rich definition can be offered as extra items at both lunch and breakfast. Grain items used to meet the meal pattern requirements must be met with whole grain rich products. If you choose to offer extra grain items, remember they will not count toward offer versus serve, but would count toward all nutrient requirements. However, these items, if desserts and non-whole grain, would still count towards the grain-based dessert requirements. So for example, if you are serving enriched grits at breakfast that are not whole grain rich, the nutrients would still count, but the grits would be considered an extra. We do not recommend that you change your bid or add additional items to your bid, as this information is subject to change. USDA has informed us that SP 10-2012 is being revised to address this question. In addition, menu planners should refrain from offering extra grains often, if at all, as they may exceed the established weekly calorie and sodium limits. Now let's talk about nuts and seeds. This is not a change, but important clarification to lunch that has previously been overlooked. If you use nuts and seeds, you must pair them with another meat or meat alternate to meet the full requirement. So for example, if you offer sunflower seeds as a meat alternate, you would need to pair that with equal amounts of another meat alternate like a cheese stick, yogurt, or hummus. The Code of Federal Regulations states that nuts or seeds may be used to meet no more than 1/2 of the meat alternate component, with another meat alternate to meet the full requirement. Nut butters are not included in this ruling, which includes peanut butter and sunflower butter. So let's talk about breakfast grains. Remember, for all grades, you must offer at least 1 ounce of grains daily. However, on a given day, you will need to offer more to meet the weekly minimums. Once you meet the 1 ounce of grains, you have the flexibility to offer meat alternate in place of grains to meet the weekly totals. Remember that all grains served must be whole grain rich, unless it is an extra item like the enriched grits that we mentioned before. In addition to the required components, you can offer extra food that would not count toward one of the required components and would not count toward offer versus serve. You would need to include the item in the dietary specifications, so extra items should be limited. You can offer meat alternate as an extra and can also offer extra enriched grains, such as the enriched grains that we mentioned previously. Let's talk about offer versus serve at breakfast. Beginning in school year 2014-15, students will be required to select at least half a cup of fruit or vegetable for the meal to be reimbursable. Full amounts of each component must be made available to choose from. If the fruit component requirement of 1 cup is offered in 2 half-cup servings, the student must be able to select both half-cup servings if he or she wants the full serving of fruit. For example, if a half a cup of peaches and a half a cup of applesauce is offered, then the student is allowed to take both for a full serving of fruit. Please remember that for offer versus serve, signage is required and will be important in implementing these changes. Now we'll play a game called Is This Reimbursable? This is an example of a question that was sent to USDA. If the breakfast menu was a whole grain bagel that counts as 2 ounce equivalent of grain, and the menu planner is counting it as 2 food items, 1 cup of skim milk, a half a cup of sliced peaches, and a half cup serving of apple, would the following be reimbursable? Timmy selects a whole grain bagel, that's 2 grains and 2 food items, and a half a cup of sliced peaches. Is this reimbursable? If you said yes, then you are correct. Timmy now selects a whole grain bagel that counts as 2 grains and 2 food items, 1 cup of milk, and a half cup of apple. Is this reimbursable? If you said yes, then you are correct. Little Sally picks up a half a cup of peaches, a cup of skim milk, and a half cup of apple. Is this reimbursable? If you said possibly, then you are correct. It depends on the menu planner if they have counted each fruit as 2 separate food items. Little Sally now selects a half cup serving of apple, a half cup or 4 fluid ounces of apple juice, and 1 cup of skim milk. Is this reimbursable? If you said yes, then you are correct. In August of 2014, the Offer versus Serve manual was updated to state that foods that are offered in large enough quantities can credit as 2 food items. For example, an apple that is large enough to count as a 1 cup serving can credit as 2 food items. So in this example, the half cup apple and half cup apple juice, since these are considered the same fruit, credits as 2 food items. Therefore, the apple juice, and the milk that Little Sally selected is considered a reimbursable meal for Offer versus Serve. Here are a list of references, including the citation on nuts and seeds. Thank you for participating in this presentation on what's new with meal pattern, sodium, and whole grains.